Welcome, and we will try to share some important information with you today on the value of biosimilars in value-based oncology care. Program disclosures. This educational program is being sponsored by Coherus Biosciences. The attendance at this promotional educational program is limited to healthcare professionals. This program is not intended or eligible for CME or for that matter, ACPE credit. And for the next few minutes, the disclosure would be that you should consider me a paid faculty member for the Coherus Biosciences Speakers Bureau. Before we get heavily into the topic of biosimilars in value-based oncology care, let's briefly talk about some important updates to the NCCN and ASCO guidelines for the prevention of febrile neutropenia and the use of growth factors. The COVID pandemic created a number of, pardon the technical difficulties, everybody. There are, before we talk about that, some important reminders about safety considerations for myeloid growth factors, specifically for the filgrastim and pegylated filgrastim products. These warnings and precautions should be familiar to most of you, but just as a brief reminder, extremely rare, but fatal splenic rupture is a potential risk. ARDS is a potential risk. Serious allergic reactions are rare, but can occur. And fatal sickle cell crises and glomerulonephritis can also occur. If any of those syndromes should occur in a patient getting any pegylated filgrastim product, including the Udenyca product, therapy should be discontinued immediately. For further information, of course, it's always important to reference the FDA-approved label or the package insert. Adverse reactions will be familiar to most of this audience, if not everyone, and that the most common meaningful adverse reaction to most patients is bone pain. The indication for any pegylated filgrastim product is to prevent the incidence and decrease the severity of febrile neutropenia. That's in the indication for all of the products, the reference product and all biosimilars. As a reminder, pegfilgrastim is not indicated for the mobilization of peripheral blood progenitor cells for stem cell transplantation. Now, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the National Cancer,
Hey, Dr. Dwight.
I apologize. I somehow got muted. All right. I apologize. I should be unmuted now. I apologize for any technical glitch.
You are good.
Okay. Now, getting back to NCCN and ASCO guidelines. Approximately 13 months ago, and it was my privilege to be part of this, the NCCN Myeloid Growth Factor panel convened a working group to talk about COVID-19 specific related updates, modifications related to the use of pegfilgrastim and other hematopoietic growth factors due to various concerns related to the COVID-19 pandemic, including wanting to get patients out of the hospital more quickly, including reducing clinic visits and visits to the infusion areas wherever possible. And those efforts continued through February and early March of 2020, leading to some appendix documents published on the websites of NCCN and ASCO. For the specifics of the complete recommendations, I would refer you to the websites of those organizations. But here's a summary. The short-term recommendations include a lowered threshold for the use of myeloid growth factors from those regimens that have a 20% risk or higher of febrile neutropenia to include intermediate 10 to 20% risk of febrile neutropenia. With a caution, physicians may wish to avoid the use of or discontinue G-CSF in case of respiratory infection, respiratory symptoms, or confirmed or suspected COVID-19 infection in order to avoid possible increased risk of pulmonary inflammation or hypothetical risk of increasing inflammatory cytokine releases associated with the virus, which could, of course, as we know, lead to severe adverse outcomes. NCCN is an organization that is, I hope, familiar to everybody in the audience. ASCO also, I hope, is familiar to everybody in the audience. As I mentioned a minute ago, the full documents are available at nccn.org and asco.org. Now on to the more mundane or more traditional topics and the full agenda. We're going to talk about some trends in oncology drug spending, briefly talk about what is a biosimilar, briefly talk about buy and bill reimbursement, and talk about value-based reimbursement and the impact that biosimilars may have on that, and some case study examples in oncology supportive care relative to the financial impact of biosimilars. Now, some of the audience, I'm presuming, are purely clinicians, and you may have a passing awareness of drug costs. I know that early in my career, many years ago at the City of Hope Cancer Center, I was blissfully unaware of the cost of drugs. But back in those days, an expensive chemotherapy regimen cost the institution hundreds of dollars. And I'm not kidding, hundreds of dollars. I risked showing my age by illustrating that difference, but the trends in oncology drug spending have changed radically since those days. Any of you in the audience who have administrative responsibilities, you are painfully aware of trends in oncology drug spending. To illustrate that, cancer drug costs are increasing faster than overall healthcare costs, which in and of themselves have been rising at rather alarming rates. This slide gives you an example, both in a bar graph and over here, of the impact that that could have on patients. So on the left side of the slide, the bar graph shows you the average annual increase in oncology drug costs in this 24-year period. 20%, that's not 20% over that time period, that's 20% annually. Now, a great deal of that is due to the arrival of new medications, but a significant portion of that is the rate of rise of individual specific innovator drugs or reference products that have had in some years rather impressive price hikes. Now, cancer medical care in general has had a 15% annual increase rate over that 25-year period. Healthcare in general, 9%. And contrasted to that, the United States gross domestic product has grown approximately 3% per year over that time period. So the take-home lesson for all of us, and there's increasing amounts of concern expressed at the governmental level, at the insurance company level, at the patient level, there's increasing concern about the total costs and the rate of rise. So On the right-hand side, to illustrate that, the blue graph, these are data from the Institute of Medicine and other respected sources. The blue line shows you median increases in household income and, I should say median monthly household income. The the green slide or green line shows you the median monthly cost for new cancer drugs in the United States. So if you look at this time period to this time period, and then you get into the 21st century, into the aughts and into the teens, you can see what feels like and looks like explosive growth in the cost of therapies compared to relatively flat or potentially decreasing median. That's not mean or mode, that's median monthly household income. So cost of care is a significant concern. Here's another way of looking at it, looking at specifically biologic drugs. And this talks about drugs that are near and dear to all of us in oncology. These are important therapeutic tools that we use every single day. But if you look at the left side of this slide, in 2018, Medicare Parts B and D spending, the biologics as a category comprised 50% or 36 billion. All other drugs were the other 50%. Looking at top oncology biologics in billions of dollars, Pembro in 2018 was 1.8 billion, nivolumab 1.7, rituximab 1.7, and so on and so forth. And these data are consistent with the drug budget impacts at my institution. Pembro and nivolumab have been at the top of the chart for quite some time. And they're important therapeutically, but they're very important financially. Over the last 18 years, biologic drugs have emerged as a larger percentage of total worldwide prescription drug spending, as illustrated by this bar graph. So you can see the blue is all other prescription drugs, the green is biologics. And so if you look at 2000 versus 2018, you see a marked increase in the cost of biologic medications. And that's just, that bar graph is just another way of demonstrating the data in the earlier slides. Looking at some specific examples. The change in the biologic WAC price over 2 years, 2016 to 2018, looking at WAC and net. And for those who might not know what WAC stands for wholesale acquisition cost. And that can be a much more useful indicator to look at than AWP, average wholesale price. So WAC is a useful number to look at for comparative purposes. Rituxan showed a 17% change in WAC over this 2-year period, a 13% change in net, 13.8. Neulasta, the reference product of pegfilgrastim, showed a 14.6% increase in WAC over that 2-year period. And then in terms of aggregated spending in the United States, Rituxan, 549 million. That's the increase. That's not the overall spend, that's the increase. Pegfilgrastim, 489 million. Again, that's not the aggregate, that's the net change of that one product. Now, onto biosimilars. Biosimilars present an opportunity to lower the economic burden of prescription drug costs for biologics by lowering drug prices, enhancing and supporting savings and efficiencies to the health system, providing more options for patients, and fostering innovation in the marketplace. Now, and we've seen that potential lived out in reality with decreases in healthcare costs with the arrival of biosimilars. And here you see reference product WAC price movement versus first biosimilar launch, looking at WAC prices. From 2016 to 2018, reference product WAC increases. We showed this for rituximab, Rituxan a moment ago. But here you have rituximab, pegfilgrastim, trastuzumab, bevacizumab, and apoetin. And then the first biosimilars for each of these agents arrived. And you can see the impact. These bars have gone from significantly positive to significantly negative. Pardon me, illustrating that the arrival of a biosimilar, therefore the arrival of competition, has a meaningful impact on rates of change of wholesale acquisition cost, leading to the conclusion that there's a significant potential savings opportunity due to biosimilars. And although they currently account for only a relatively small portion of the total spend, it's projected that that will grow over time. You can see by this graph here, the blue is all biologics or all other biologics. This this gray bar is reference products which have biosimilar competition available. And then the green is the biosimilar itself, the biosimilars in terms of drug spend themselves. We think these, over time, the green bar will become bigger, as will the dark gray. Illustrating that, this is a projected timeline for the approval by the FDA and or the commercial launch of biosimilars for these medications. We've already seen it for G-CSF filgrastim. We've already seen it for trastuzumab. We've already seen it for bevacizumab, and for pegfilgrastim, for apoetin. We've already seen it for rituximab. We anticipate cetuximab, panitumumab, denosumab in both its Xgeva and Prolia dose forms. At some point, pertuzumab. At some point, ipilimumab. These timeframes are somewhat open to variation. The originator companies, the reference product companies will occasionally use various mechanisms at their disposal to delay the arrival of competition from biosimilars. So these timeframes are not finalized and could change. What is a biosimilar? Well, let's just go back. This audience is a group of pharmacists. So we all realize that given enough time, we could all probably synthesize aspirin in our garage if we wanted to. Simple chemicals. Here's a slightly more complicated chemical, gemcitabine. And its molecular weight is 263 Daltons. In contrast, filgrastim is 18.8 kilodaltons, thus illustrating the differences between synthesizing and therefore manufacturing small molecules versus proteins, which are produced by recombinant DNA technology And they're large molecules, they're proteins, and they're just much more difficult by size and complexity to produce, and much more time consuming and costly, therefore. So considering that, in the United States, which was trailing the European Union and the European Medications Agency by a few years, passed the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, or the BPCIA, which created an abbreviated biosimilar approval pathway. It was sort of the biologics version of the Hatch-Waxman Generic Drug Act of 1984. The Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984 expedited the arrival of generic forms of small molecule, simple chemical drugs. The BPCIA of 2009 created structurally somewhat of a similar abbreviated approval pathway for biologics. Not identical, but somewhat similar philosophically. I'm going to skip over this because as a group of pharmacists, we know this. Let's talk about something that may be less familiar to the younger clinicians in the audience. It's anybody with administrative responsibilities is extremely aware of what we're going to be talking about in the next few slides. But by and large, hospitals, ambulatory infusion centers, healthcare providers in general, administer medications under the buy and bill reimbursement model. That's partly self-explanatory in that you purchase the medication, you administer it to the patient, and then you bill the insurer for the cost of that medication. And so in a buy and bill model, you are at risk to changes in reimbursement processes. And you always need to be conscious of reimbursement procedural requirements or process changes stipulated by payers. Coding is an important concept of that. The ASP model and methodology is an important part of that. ASP stands for average sales price, and how the government calculates that is a function of aggregating data across all brands of a specific med. And so the ASP methodology can be extremely important if the ASP is predicated on a generic cost of the medication, and then something happens where the generic brand or brands is no longer available and only the trade name is available. There was a case in April of 2010 where there was a legal agreement between a particular drug company and 6 generic drug companies that removed all generic competition for that particular medication for a 2-year period. And for folks who were not aware of that impending change, and on July 1 of 2010, were purchasing the only available product, the trade name, and getting reimbursed because Medicare thought the generic from 3 months earlier was the product being given. Those patients were being paid on an average sales price of the generic rather than the actual price of the trade name, which was 3 times higher. So that's a very anonymized example, but an important one of how important paying attention to any fluctuations in market availability, trade name versus generic, can be, how important that can be to your overall financial health. Now, CMS recognized that reimbursement formulas for trade name or reference products versus biosimilars could be extremely important, and recognized that it is true that if you buy a more expensive medication and administer that to the patient, and the reimbursement to you is predicated on the cost of that higher cost medication, that if you used a less expensive product, that you would actually get less reimbursement. Now, everything's a balance between cost of drug and amount reimbursed. So let me try to explain that with an example. The reference product reimbursement, ASP plus 6%. Now there's discussion about with the congressional sequester, does the 6 become 4.2? But the point is, it's the average sale price of the reference product. If there's a biosimilar that arrives, for the first 2 quarters, because CMS needs time to accumulate data and aggregate it to determine and calculate an ASP, initially, the biosimilar is reimbursed at WAC plus 3%. After enough data is aggregated and CMS can derive a fee schedule, once an ASP is established, reimbursement occurs at the average sale price of the biosimilar plus 6% of the cost, the ASP, not of the biosimilar, but of the reference product. And the reason for that is to not penalize people for using the less expensive biosimilar and to not thwart the growth of an important new market or group of medications. Here's how that would play out at an individual drug level. The Medicare ASP drug pricing is derived for, in this case, the reference product is Neulasta, the 6 milligram syringe, excuse me, and the ASP in the first quarter of calendar 2020 was $4,016. The Medicare reimbursement is that number plus 6%, or $4,257. Now at that same time interval, the biosimilar pegfilgrastim CBQV, trade name Udenyca, had an average selling price, ASP, of $3,797. So reimbursement is ASP of that plus 6% of that, leading to a net reimbursement per dose for that time interval of $4,038. So the healthcare provider in this case would be paying over $200 less for the product, but getting not being penalized for that because the overall revenue is not unfavorable. So you stated another way, if you look at the difference between this and this, so the revenue margin is about $240, whereas the revenue margin here is favorable to the biosimilar. So this is a win-win for instance, CMS, Medicare, by paying less, but the healthcare provider is not disadvantaged. So Medicare may save more than $1,300 per patient across 6 doses or 6 cycles of chemotherapy, but the healthcare provider individually is not harmed financially. Now, the 340B program, and some of your institutions may be in the 340B program, that is a complicated additional example of reimbursement implications of the buy and bill reimbursement dynamics. For those who are not familiar with 340B, 340B is a drug cost discount program mandated by the federal government participated in by drug companies, where the drug companies provide a mandatory discount to 340B eligible hospitals for most brand name prescription drugs. And that on average, this is a global average, that discount is 23.1%. So how that would play out in this arena, you have a reference product. Buy and bill drugs without pass-through would then be reimbursed at ASP minus 22.5%. So hospitals that are eligible for 340B would be paid at ASP minus 22.5% on average. But again, they're paying on average, generally speaking, 23.1% less for drugs. So then a biosimilar product is launched. The biosimilar ASP reimbursement model is for 3 years after the ASP is established, reimbursement for biosimilars with pass-through status would be ASP plus 6% of the reference biologic ASP. After 3 years, then the biosimilar ASP reimbursement would then become 22.5% less than the biosimilar ASP. And again, when you're purchasing medications for 23 or more percent less than ASP, you're not harmed by this fee structure. Talking about value-based reimbursement and the impact of biosimilars, the healthcare landscape is shifting from paying providers by volume to models looking at estimations, calculations of value. So we're trying to move from volume-driven healthcare to value-driven healthcare. And the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015, abbreviated MACRA, as we all know, government likes a lot of acronyms. So MACRA was a bipartisan bill that was signed into law in April of 2015. It created the quality payment program that repealed the sustainable growth rate formula, changes the way Medicare rewards clinicians for value over volume, streamlines multiple quality programs under what's called the Merit-Based Incentive Payments System, or MIPS, and then gives bonus payments for participation in eligible alternative payment models, or APMs. Interesting side note, MACRA also required CMS, as of April 2019, required CMS to remove Social Security numbers from Medicare beneficiary Medicare ID cards. For those of you who have parents who are receiving care by Medicare, funded by Medicare, and I was surprised to see this myself when my parents needed help from me to the point where I was seeing their Medicare cards. I said, holy cow, their Social Security number is on the card. That's not good. Well, MACRA solved that in 2019. But getting back to the implications for us as providers, MACRA is a very comprehensive piece of legislation with many, many implications, which we don't have time to go into today in full detail. But just to suffice to say that MACRA stands for the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015. And just as a reminder that the CHIP program, CHIP stands for the Children's Health Insurance Program. So how this plays out, MACRA establishes 2 payment pathways based on performance. OCM and MIPS both incentivize practices to lower cost. And this is a very brief Cliff Notes version summary of a very complicated model that one can research more fully on the cms.gov website. But Providers have exemptions for the first year, and then they can go into the advanced alternative payment model, a new payment model that supports high-value services not typically covered under Medicare. And in oncology, a number of our institutions are participating in the OCM, or Oncology Care Model, which is an advanced APM with performance-based payments to oncology providers. Other providers may transition into MIPS, the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, which is a modified fee-for-service model. Now, for those of you who are pure clinicians in the audience and your head is about to explode with all of these acronyms and all of this confusing mumbo jumbo, I feel your pain. I've been there. Learning about all of these reimbursement nuances is extremely complicated. And I have to confess that not only have I transitioned over my career from not having any idea what medications cost when I was purely an inpatient clinical pharmacist, but to the point now where I am on speed dial with the chief financial officer, with the director of the patient billing department, with the director of the payer relations department, because reimbursement is so vital to the financial health of both my institution, Fox Chase Cancer Center, but also to the health system to which Fox Chase belongs. So we won't spend any more painful time on the nitty-gritty of it, except to say that the oncology care model desires to reward oncology care providers for improvements and sustained contributions in quality of clinical care, patient and caregiver experience, and coordination of care. And biosimilars contribute to the success of that model by reducing drug expenses, potentially resulting in higher performance-based payments. The Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS, issues provider scores which determine payment adjustments, looking at cost, quality improvement activities, interoperability, quality in general. Biosimilars can contribute to success by reducing the cost category. So biosimilars support practices moving towards value-based care, supporting two major components. The first is extremely obvious, decreasing cost, without impairing or hampering quality. Here's an example. Biosimilars providing cost savings, looking at a hypothetical example of a conversion from the reference product to a biosimilar. Here is WAC, 6,200, 4,175. If you purchase or administer 2,000 doses per year, fiscal or calendar, of either drug, your annual drug spend would be either 12,400,000 or 8,350,000. So this is back of napkin or do it in your head without a calculator. It's pretty straightforward that a biosimilar can decrease the drug acquisition budget of the institution by over $4 million. And if there's any directors of pharmacy in the audience today, I share your pain. I have financial people asking me about drug costs all the time. Fortunately, in my institution as a comprehensive cancer center, of our drug costs at Fox Chase, 95% of my total drug cost is in my ambulatory infusion program or my outpatient specialty retail pharmacy. So our inpatient drug spend is a very small percentage of that. But for those institutions that live and die on your inpatient drug costs, those directors of pharmacy are getting harassed about drug costs all day, every day. Now, patients are not impervious unless their last name is Gates or Bezos or Musk. If your last name isn't one of those, you care about out-of-patient drug cost. So here's an example with a reference product, Neulasta in this case. Commercial payers average out-of-pocket per dose. In this example, $843 for the originator product, the reference product. In this case, for the biosimilar pegfilgrastim CBQV, out of pocket, in this example, $341. And as we increasingly hear about from our patients that we're treating, from family members who may be patients who are being treated elsewhere, out-of-pocket costs can become a crippling situation for some families. Here's an example of the impact of the product Udenyca. This biosimilar has contributed to nearly $1 billion in total healthcare cost savings in 2019, according to this impartial data from the PriceRx third-party data aggregator. And this slide, this line is a projection of what the price increases might have been if biosimilars had not entered the arena. Based on the earlier data that I showed you of reference product price increases year by year by year in the absence of any competition from a biosimilar competitor. And these are just some examples of how that translates into aggregated costs. So in summary, the use of biosimilars can help physicians and by extension, practice groups, hospital outpatient departments, comprehensive cancer center outpatient departments, etc. Reduce costs to the healthcare system. And some of the new programs that I briefly described to you in Cliff Notes version, potentially allowing healthcare providers to share with payers in the realized savings. And biosimilars can reduce costs while delivering similar quality clinical results as the reference products. CMS reimbursement pathways provide continued incentive for the development and use of biosimilars. Biosimilars can also help save costs in these new programs, these value-based reimbursement practices, such as the APMs, for example, the OCM, or in the MIPS. And then, of course, the slide I just showed you, patient out-of-pocket costs. These are all very important to, some are felt at the macro level, some are felt at the individual patient, but they're all important. And just a couple of disclosures, I've mentioned the approved slide deck has mentioned a number of products and included their trade names, and just to give you this disclosure slide. And with that, I will thank you for your kind attention, and I'd be more than happy to try to answer any questions.
Thanks, Dr. Cloth. Great presentation. We just have opened the chat for everybody to ask questions, and I see that there is one that is partially typed at this precise moment. So we'll give people just a couple minutes here to see if they can come in and type their questions. So our first question is, how does your institution manage the multiple biosimilars that are available per reference product? Do you carry all and dispense brand based on payer?
Oh, that is such a painful question. Let me try to explain how we've grappled with this. And I am sure we are not the only ones. So I'm sure that my audience is going to be feeling sympathy for what I'm going to describe. We approved at Fox Chase a formulary biosimilar. And then insurance company XYZ says, well, gee, that's nice, but we're not going to pay you for that because we're going to demand that you use a biosimilar by this other company. And then, so insurance company ABC says, we want product X. And then insurance company DEF says, well, we want product Y. And then the next company wants product Z. So what we've actually done is we have formulary status for our preferred product. And we've kind of created a status that we call non-formulary, but demanded by an insurance company. And we did that intentionally at the P&T committee level so that we would, number one, have a CDM created in the patient billing system, which would link to Epic Beacon so that when the latest, and sometimes we've proactively gone out and just done this ahead of time as soon as the latest biosimilar showed up, just in anticipation, because it can take 2 to 3 weeks for the health system corporate headquarters to issue a CDM. And it just creates all sorts of havoc if your computer systems infrastructure is not set up ahead of time. So it's a lot of front end work by the pharmacy department to create these additional CDMs, to create additional structure within Epic Beacon. But the comprehensive system is similar if you have Cerner, I would suppose. But that's how we do it. Now, there's several downsides, not the least of which is I'm in discussions with the facilities team and with the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer about some renovations we need to do to our physical plant. And I'm saying, oh, by the way, one of the reasons that I need to expand our storage areas to the extent I'm talking about is I need to buy more refrigerators for biosimilars that are not formulary, but insurance companies are demanding. So I hope that is helpful for the person who asked the question, but that's been our approach, to anticipate ahead of time that these demands will come up and to try to have an infrastructure set up ahead of time so it's not a fire drill when the circumstance arises, because you can't predict ahead of time when it will. So the more you can try to have contingency plans, the safer you'll be.
Absolutely. So thank you. We have several other questions. So the next one is, how do you address physician support for switching to a biosimilar?
I'm sorry, say again, please.
How do you address physician support to switch to a biosimilar?
You know, that's interesting. I had had a lot of trepidation about what, not so much with growth factors, because the short-acting filgrastim arena, that was kind of our initial foray for us. And pegfilgrastim was really straightforward. I had a fair chunk of trepidation about what happens with bevacizumab, what happens with rituximab, what happens with trastuzumab. And two things surprised me. My medical faculty was much more accepting of the data than I thought they'd be. And then the other thing, and every once in a while, the insurance companies will help you. One of our early situations with a cytotoxic biosimilar was a situation where the insurance company said, hey, you can give the reference product if you want, but we're not going to pay for it. if you use this biosimilar that we demand, then we'll pay for it. And it happened to be a biosimilar that we were going to want to use anyway. So that's how we tried to make some lemonade out of lemons in that setting. I don't know if that helps you for the questioner, but I was delighted with my faculty are incredibly smart people. I'm on research committees with them. They're incredibly smart, and they're persuaded by objective, non-biased data, and that carried the day. And the insurance company restrictions in a couple of cases actually helped us.
Fantastic. And I think this is in line with the same question, but there was a specific question about rituximab biosimilar for curative intent.
Well, it's really part and parcel of the same question. If you want to use a medication for palliative purposes, if you're going to use a medication for curative, you're going to want to use that same medication for palliative. Nobody wants to give a drug that doesn't work well, period.
Fantastic. So the next question is talking about the time of administration after chemo. So Onpro is not available for the biosimilar product for automatic administration, or another option is same-day administration. And do you apply this option in your institute?
Well, that's a complicated question with a complicated answer. I would commend the originator company, the development of and the timing of the development of the Onpro delivery device was a stroke of genius. And we still use a fair amount of Onpro in our institution because so many of our patients come from a great distance to come here. It's a little bit of a different story if your patient population is geographically in your same zip code. And I've talked to some colleagues. I talked to a colleague, I won't mention his name, but in his institution, he's got almost no Onpro. It's all syringe. I was flabbergasted. I said, how did you make that work? He said, well, we're dense inner city. People don't travel a long ways, and we've made it work. So timing of administration. Yeah, that's a challenge. And we've had some success with payers in letting us administer the drug in certain cases on day of treatment. But we've also had the reverse where Mrs. Jones receives her chemo at 3 o'clock. She finishes her chemo or Mr. Smith finishes at 3 p.m. They come back the next day, they get a pegfilgrastim syringe at 1 p.m. and the payer dings it, rejects it because it wasn't 24 hours later. And of course, that's bang your head on the desk kind of frustration stuff. And what we've done is determine what payers are going to do that to us and really take that into account when we structure some of our processes. It's a challenge because some of those are just unpleasant surprises. And then you get into back and forth appeals, denials, appeals, peer-to-peer, and it's very frustrating for my faculty. You've got an ASCO member, associate professor, or full professor having a peer-to-peer with a non-physician. That is beyond frustrating when that happens, but that does happen from time to time. I hope that helps the questioner.
Yeah, and then the last question we have up is, do you wait to use biosimilars until the HCPC codes are released?
We've done a bit of a mix, I think. We try to embrace biosimilars as rapidly as possible. And we try to work with payers so that they are reminded that we can't give them a drug-specific code if one does not exist yet. I think that question speaks to the I mentioned a few minutes ago that I'm on speed dial with the guy in payer relations, and the person in patient billing and the CFO, et cetera. It speaks to the importance of the dynamic. Pharmacy plays an incredibly important role in the financial health of every organization, and that is very appreciated, very recognized in my institution. Hopefully it is true at the institutions represented in our audience group today. But these are examples where those relationships, if anything, should be strengthened. And pharmacy is a critical part of revenue cycle. As an advisor, a consultant, an expert member of that team.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Those are all the questions we got from our audience today. And I really appreciate you, and I appreciate Coherus as a member of HOPA's Industry Relations Council for bringing this important information to our members today. So thank you and have a great evening.
Stay warm, everybody.